My name's Eduardo Cadava, and on behalf of Wilson College, I'd like to welcome you to the first of 3 events this week that are meant first to mark the end of my tenure as the head of Wilson College, and second to celebrate the Wilson College Signature Lecture Series, which is now in its 7th year, closing its 7th year. I know that many of you have attended lectures in this series before, but for those of you who are here for the first time, I inaugurated the series in the fall of 2010 as part of the 50th anniversary celebration of the opening of Wilcox Hall and Wilson Quad in 1960, which we celebrated in November 2010. In celebrating the early years of Wilson's founding, we wish to celebrate the students who founded the Wilson Society and the Wilson Lodge, the early templates for Princeton's residential system, and who did so in order to create a friendly alternative to Princeton's eating clubs as part of a stance against discrimination, privilege, and exclusion, as part of a desire to create a place on campus where students could be who they are, and which would bring together faculty and students as we're doing today. This week is meant to once again honor this founding act of social justice, and also to close the Signature Lecture Series in a way that, for me, announces everything it has wanted to be. A series devoted to issues of social justice, and this because I've always understood Wilson College's early founding as itself an act of social justice. Since its beginning, everyone who has participated in this series has been a voice for social justice, has produced work in relation to the promise of emancipation and political struggle, to the promise of a more just and less exclusionary world, and to the experience and promise of an activism worthy of the name activism. I believe this series has been wildly successful, but I never would have been able to do what I did with the series without the assistance and support of Wilson's rather remarkable staff. They've supported me in everything I've wanted to do, no matter how ambitious some of our events have been. And I want to take this moment to thank Ann Caswell-Klein, Jack Axelson, Aaron King, Jessica Heslin, and especially Lori Hebditch, without whose attentiveness and scrupulousness this series never could have happened. And where's Lori?
There.
There she is. Thank you, Lori. Okay, this is it. This is like one little example, right? This isn't something that Lori really has to do in her job description, but when we brought Charles Lloyd and Maria Faranduri, the jazz saxophonist and the Greek singer, to Princeton, Lori and I are running around the day of the event looking for a hairdresser, because Maria wanted a hairdresser in the dressing room before the performance. Okay? This is like beyond the call of any duty. Okay? I also want to mention Michael Olin, Lisa Hirschbach, Reagan Crotty, and Evelyn Spradley, who also were present during the early years of the series. In regard to tonight, I want to thank the Council for the Humanities, the Princeton Institute for International Regional Studies, the Center for Human Values, the Department of African American Studies, the Department of English, the Interdisciplinary Doctoral Program in the Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, the Office of the Dean of the College, the Office of the Vice President for Campus Life, the Religious Life Council, and Campus Conversations on Identities, all of whom helped make this evening's event possible, and many of whom contributed to the full week of events. I want to note that all the speakers and performers who are here this week have participated in the series in one way or another. So this week is a kind of reunion of sorts. This evening, we're very honored to have Chris Hedges, Fazal Sheikh, Gayartri Chakravorty Spivak, Liana Theodoratou, and Cornel West with us. I mean, it's kind of amazing to have them all up here, right? We also, tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. in Richardson Auditorium, Peter Sellers and Reggie Gray will present Flex in Princeton, featuring dancers from the Dream Ring, who I understand are some of them are on their way here now. You'll see them arriving maybe a little late. And many of whom are with us tonight, as I say. And Sunday the 23rd, Amy Goodman will visit us at Labyrinth Books, in an event that's co-sponsored by Labyrinth Books, the Princeton Public Library, and Wilson College. So I hope that you'll come to as much of this celebratory week as you can. I know that each of the events will be very special in its own way. But now for tonight's event. There are, of course, many reasons why I've chosen the topic of how to sustain an activist life. Because the series has been linked to a quite broad set of activist contexts, it seemed appropriate to begin closing it with a set of reflections on the many kinds of activism that exist today. And I should mention that I decided on this topic because of a conversation I had with Anne Caswell-Klein last fall, much before the recent election. Nevertheless, it's also the case that this is a political and historical moment that, in my mind, requires activisms of all kinds, and because the threats and dangers we increasingly are facing are occurring on so many fronts, I think we all need to find ways to sustain not only our activism, but our lives. I'm hoping that today's event can be the catalyst for such sustenance. Now, I will offer just brief introductions to each speaker, and then we'll proceed in alphabetical order, with each speaker talking for about 10, 15 minutes each, and then we're going to open up the auditorium to discussion. Chris Hedges is an American journalist, activist, and author. He's known as the best-selling author of several books, including War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle, and Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt. He spent nearly 2 decades as a foreign correspondent in Central America, the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. He's reported from more than 50 countries, and in 2002, Hedges was part of a group of 8 reporters at the New York Times awarded the Pulitzer Prize for the paper's coverage of global terrorism. He's taught at Columbia University, NYU, Princeton University, and the University of Toronto. He currently teaches prisoners at a maximum security prison in New Jersey. Fazal Sheikh was born in New York City. Since 1987, he's actually an alumnus of Princeton. Since 1987, he's worked as a photographer, documenting the lives of individuals in displaced communities across East Africa, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Brazil, Cuba, India, and the occupied territories. He's received many awards, including the Infinity Award from the International Center of Photography, the Leica Medal of Excellence, the Cartier-Bresson International Grand Prize, and the Lucy Humanitarian Award. In 2005, he was named a MacArthur Fellow, and his books include A Sense of Common Ground, The Victor Weeps, Ramadan Moon, Moksha, and in 2015, the Erasure Trilogy. Gayartri Chakravorty Spivak was born in Calcutta, and in Calcutta, West Bengal. She was the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh till 1991, and is currently University Professor at Columbia University, where she also was the founding member of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. She has been active in hands-on educational reform and teacher training in Aboriginal India for more than 2 decades, and is active in other social movements. Her publications include, among many others, In Other Worlds, The Postcolonial Critic, Outside in the Teaching Machine, and Death of a Discipline. She's translated many texts, including Jacques Derrida's Of Grammatology and Bengali author-activist Mahasveta Devi's Imaginary Maps. Liana Theodoratou was born in Athens, Greece. She's clinical professor and director of the A.S. Onassis program in Hellenic Studies at NYU. Trained as a classicist, she specializes in modern Greek literature and culture, and in particular on the poetry of the post-war generation of Greek poets, including Takis Sinopoulos, Manolis Anagnostakis, and Yannis Ritsos. She's translated writings by Walter Benjamin, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Derrida into modern Greek, and she recently co-translated Nadar's memoirs when I was a photographer for MIT Press. Since the 1980s, she's been a public advocate for civil rights and justice in Greece and in the US, and in 2016, she was the president of the Athens and Epidaurus Festival in Greece. Cornel West is a prominent and provocative democratic intellectual. He's taught at Union Theological Seminary, Yale, Harvard, and the University of Paris. He's written more than 20 books. He's best known for his classic Race Matters, Democracy Matters, and his memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. He appears frequently on The Bill Maher Show, Colbert Report, CNN, C-SPAN as well as on Tavia Smiley's PBS TV show. He's appeared in over 25 documentaries and films, including Examined Life, Call and Response, Sidewalk and Stand, and he stated that one of his most impassioned hopes is to carry on the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., a legacy of telling the truth and bearing witness to love and justice. I'm going to now turn the floor over to our distinguished speakers. Please help me welcome them to Princeton and Wilson College.
conflicts I covered as a reporter in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans. I encountered singular individuals of varying creeds, religions, races, and nationalities who majestically rose up to defy the oppressor on behalf of the oppressed. Some of them are dead, some of them are forgotten, most of them are unknown. These individuals, despite their vast cultural differences, had common traits: a profound commitment to the truth, incorruptibility, courage, a distrust of power, a hatred of violence, and a deep empathy that was extended to people who were different from them, even to people defined by the dominant culture as the enemy. They are the most remarkable men and women I met in my 20 years as a foreign correspondent, and to this day, I set my life by the standards they set. You have heard of some of them, such as Václav Havel, whom I and other foreign reporters met most evenings during the 1989 Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, in the Magic Lantern Theater in Prague. Others no less great you probably do not know, such as the Jesuit priest Ignacio Ellacuría, who was assassinated in El Salvador in 1989. And then there are those ordinary people, although as the writer V.S. Pritchett said, no people are ordinary, who risked their lives in wartime to shelter and protect those of an opposing religion or ethnicity being persecuted and hunted. And to some of these ordinary people, I owe my life. To resist radical evil is to endure a life that by the standards of the wider society is a failure. It is to defy injustice at the cost of your career, your reputation, your financial solvency, and at times your life. It is to be a lifelong heretic. And perhaps this is the most important point. It is to accept that the dominant culture, even the liberal elites, will push you to the margins and attempt to discredit not only what you do, but your character. When I returned to the newsroom at the New York Times, after being in 2003 reprimanded for denouncing the invasion of Iraq, reporters and editors I had known and worked with for 15 years lowered their heads or turned away when I was nearby. They did not want to be contaminated by the same career-killing contagion. Ruling institutions, the state, the press, the church, courts, academia, mouth the language of morality, but they serve the structures of power, no matter how venal, which provide them with money, status, and authority. In times of national distress, one has only to look at Nazi Germany. All these institutions, including the Academy, are complicit through their silence or their active collaboration with radical evil. And our own institutions, which have surrendered to corporate power and the utopian ideology of neoliberalism, are no different. The lonely individuals who defy tyrannical power within these institutions, as we saw with the thousands of academics who were fired from their jobs and blacklisted during the McCarthy era, are purged and turned into pariahs. All institutions, including the church, Paul Tillich once wrote, are inherently demonic. And a life dedicated to resistance has to accept that a relationship with any institution is often temporary, because sooner or later, that institution is going to demand acts of silence or obedience your conscience will not allow you to make. To be a rebel is to reject what it means to succeed in a capitalist consumer culture, especially the idea that we should come first. The theologian James Cone, in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, writes that for oppressed blacks, the cross was a paradoxical religious symbol because it inverts the world's value system with the news that hope comes by way of defeat, that suffering and death do not have the last word, that the last shall be first and the first last. Cone continues that God could make a way out of no way in Jesus' cross was truly absurd to the intellect, yet profoundly real in the souls of black folk. Enslaved blacks who first heard the message, the gospel message, seized on the power of the cross. Christ crucified manifested God's loving and liberating presence in the contradictions of black life. That transcendent presence in the lives of black Christians that empowered them to believe that ultimately, in God's eschatological future, they would not be defeated by the troubles of this world, no matter how great and painful their suffering. Believing this paradox, this absurd claim of faith, was only possible in humility and repentance. There was no place for the proud and the mighty, for people who think that God called them to rule over others. The cross was God's critique of power, white power, with powerless love, snatching victory out of defeat. Reinhold Niebuhr labeled this capacity to defy forces of repression a sublime madness in the soul. Niebuhr wrote that nothing but madness will do battle with malignant power and spiritual wickedness in high places. This sublime madness, as Niebuhr understood, is dangerous, but it is vital. Without it, truth is obscured. And Niebuhr also knew that traditional liberalism was a useless force in moments of extremity. Liberalism, Niebuhr said, lacks the spirit of enthusiasm, not to say fanaticism, which is so necessary to move the world out of its beaten tracks. It is too intellectual and too little emotional to be an efficient force in history. The prophets in the Hebrew Bible had this sublime madness. The words of the prophets, Abraham Heschel wrote, were a scream in the night. While the world is at ease and asleep, the prophet feels the blast from heaven. The prophet, because he saw and faced an unpleasant reality, was, as Heschel said, compelled to proclaim the very opposite of what his or her heart expected. This sublime madness is the essential quality for a life of resistance. It is the acceptance that when you stand with the oppressed, you will be treated like the oppressed. It is the acceptance that, although empirically all that we struggle to achieve during our lifetime may be worse, our struggle validates itself. Daniel Berrigan told me that faith is the belief that the good draws to it the good. The Buddhists call this karma. But he said for us as Christians, we did not know where it went. We trusted that it went somewhere. We are called to do the good, or at least the good insofar as we can determine it, and then let it go. As Hannah Arendt wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism, the only morally reliable people are not those who say this is wrong or this should not be done, but those who say I can't. They know that, as Immanuel Kant wrote, if justice perishes, human life on earth has lost its meaning. And this means that, like Socrates, we must come to a place where it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. We must at once see and act and give it what it means to see. This will require the surmounting of despair, not by reason, but by faith. I saw in the conflicts I covered the power of this faith which lies outside of any religious or philosophical or political creed. This faith is what Havel called in his great essay, The Power of the Powerless, living in truth. Living in truth exposes the corruption, lies, and deceit of the state. It is a refusal to be part of the charade. You do not become a dissident just because you decide one day to take up this most unusual career, Havel wrote. You are thrown into it by your personal sense of responsibility, combined with a complex set of external circumstances. You are cast out of the existing structures and placed in a position of conflict with them. It begins as an attempt to do your work well, and it ends with being branded an enemy of the state. The dissident does not operate in the realm of genuine power at all. He or she is not seeking power. He or she has no desire for office and does not gather votes. He or she does not attempt to charm the public. He or she offers nothing and promises nothing. He or she can offer, if anything, only their own skin, and they offer it solely because they have no other way of affirming the truth they stand for. These actions simply articulate their dignity as a citizen, regardless of the cost. A long, long road of sacrifice and suffering that led to the collapse of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe stretched back decades. Those who made this change possible were those who had discarded all notions of the practical. They did not try to reform the Communist Party. They did not try to attempt to work within the system. They did not even know what, if anything, their tiny protests, ignored by the state-controlled media, would accomplish. But through it all, they held fast to moral imperatives. They did so because these values were right and just. They expected no reward for their virtue. Indeed, they got none. They were marginalized and persecuted. And yet these poets, playwrights, actors, singers, writers finally triumphed over state and military power. They drew the good to the good. They triumphed because however cowed and broken the masses around them appeared, their message of defiance did not go unheard. It did not go unseen. The steady drumbeat of rebellion constantly exposed the dead hand of authority and the rot of the state. I stood with hundreds of thousands of rebellious Czechoslovakians in 1989 on a cold winter night in Prague's Wenceslas Square as the singer Marta Kubashova approached the balcony of the Melantric building. Kubashova had been banished from the airwaves in 1968 after the Soviet invasion for her anthem of defiance, Prayer for Marta. Her entire catalog, including more than 200 singles, had been confiscated and destroyed by the state. She had disappeared from public view. Her voice that night suddenly flooded the square. Pressing around me were throngs of students, most of whom had not been born when she had vanished. And they began to sing the words of that anthem. There were tears running down their faces. It was then that I understood the power of rebellion. It was then that I knew that no act of rebellion, however futile it appears in the moment, is wasted. It was then that I knew the communist regime was finished. The walls of Prague were covered that chilly winter with posters depicting Jan Palach. Palach, a university student, set himself on fire in Wenceslas Square on January 16, 1969, in the middle of the day, to protest the crushing of the country's democracy movement. He died of his burns 3 days later. The state swiftly attempted to erase this act from national memory. There was no mention of it in the state media. A funeral march by university students was broken up by police. Palach's gravesite, which became a shrine, saw the communist authorities exhume his body, cremate his remains, and ship them to his mother with the provision that his ashes could not be placed in a cemetery. But it did not work. His defiance became a rallying cry. His sacrifice spurred the students in the winter of 1989 to act. And Prague's Red Army Square, shortly after I left to cover the uprising in Romania, was renamed Palach Square, and 10,000 people went to the dedication. We, like those who opposed the long night of communism, no longer have any mechanisms within the formal structures of power that will protect or advance our rights. We too have undergone a coup d'etat, carried out not by the stone-faced leaders of a monolithic communist party, but by the corporate state. We may feel in the face of the ruthless corporate destruction of our nation, our culture, our ecosystem, powerless and weak, but we are not. We have a power that terrifies the corporate state. Any act of rebellion, no matter how few people show up or how heavily it is censored, chips away at corporate power. Any act of rebellion keeps alive the embers for larger movements that follow us. It passes on another narrative. It will, as the state consumes itself, attract wider and wider numbers. Perhaps this will not happen in our lifetimes, but if we persist, we will keep this possibility alive. If we do not, it will die. The doctor in Albert Camus' novel, The Plague, is not driven by ideology. He is driven by empathy, the duty to minister to suffering, no matter the cost. And empathy, or what the Russian novelist Vasily Grossman called simple human kindness, becomes in despotisms a subversive act. To act on this empathy, the empathy for human beings locked in cages less than an hour from us, the empathy for undocumented mothers and fathers being torn from their children on the streets of our cities, the empathy for Muslims who are demonized and banned from our shores, fleeing the wars we created, the empathy for poor people of color gunned down by police in our streets, the empathy for girls and women trafficked into prostitution, the empathy for all those who suffer at the hands of a state intent on militarization and imposing a harsh cruelty on the vulnerable, the empathy for the earth that gives us life and that is being contaminated and pillaged for profit, becomes political and even dangerous. Evil is real, but so is love. And in war, especially when the heavy shells landed on crowds in Sarajevo, sight so gruesome that to this day I cannot eat a piece of meat. You could feel as frantic family members desperately sought out loved ones among the wounded and dead, the concentric circles of death and love, like rings from the blast of a cosmic furnace. Flannery O'Connor recognized that a life of faith is a life of confrontation. St. Cyril of Jerusalem, she wrote in instructing catechumens, said, "The dragon sits by the side of the road watching those who pass. Beware, lest he devour you." We go to the Father of souls, but it is necessary to pass by the dragon, no matter what form the dragon may take. It is this mysterious passage past him or into his jaws that stories of any depth will be concerned to tell. And this being the case, it requires considerable courage at any time, in any country, not to turn away from the storyteller. Accept sorrow, for who cannot be profoundly sorrowful at the state of our nation, the world, our ecosystem? But know that in resistance there is a balm that leads to wisdom, if not joy, a strange transcendent happiness. Know that if we resist, we keep hope alive. My faith has been tempered in hell, wrote Vasily Grossman in his masterpiece, Life and Fate. My faith has emerged from the flames of the crematoria, from the concrete of the gas chamber. I have seen that it is not man who is impotent in the struggle against evil, but the power of evil that is impotent in the struggle against man. The powerlessness of kindness, of senseless kindness, is the secret of its immortality. It can never be conquered. The more stupid, the more senseless, the more helpless it may seem, the vaster it is. Evil is impotent before it. The prophets, religious leaders, reformers, social and political leaders are impotent before it. This dumb, blind love is man's meaning. Human history is not the battle of good struggling to overcome evil. It is a battle fought by a great evil struggling to crush a small kernel of human kindness. But if what is human in human beings has not been destroyed even now, then evil will never conquer. Thank you.
I think you can prepare yourself for something of a change of pace now.
But you can project.
Sorry.
Mike, yeah.
When Eduardo first wrote to me last fall with this notion in mind, it was at a moment when I was myself feeling very unsettled by my own practice, somehow self-involved with a degree of sort of pity and without the resolve that Chris is just beckoning us to have now, which I found very heartening, but in a sense, I had to turn back on myself and wonder what I had been doing for 25 years, thinking that perhaps I was involved in some kind of conversation, some kind of dialogue, making images that perhaps would encourage people to contemplate. Not perhaps in a very forceful, activist, violent way, but perhaps an image can convince you in another, more gentle, subtle way over time. The opportunity to return to an image, to let it woo you, for your attention to subtly perhaps undermine the way in which you have thought about other communities, other people. When I arrived from Europe the other day on a Saturday, I went to the Museum of Modern Art, where a friend of mine, Jody Hauptmann, had been part of a team of curators who, in the week after the first travel ban, were discussing with one another, we're in the realm of arts, what can we do to participate? And they came up with a solution that I found extremely beautiful. They went to the upper echelon of the galleries, the permanent collection, the area where the masters like Picasso, Braque, Matisse are housed. And they selectively interspersed some images from people that hail from nations that would potentially now not be able to visit the museum. And what they did in this very sort of understated, gentle way was that they insisted that there is this kind of dialogue across borders, that the West, that Matisse was influenced by Moroccans, that an image from the Sudan can stand close by a Picasso, and that we, in fact, need this kind of quality of conversation, of cross-fertilization. And this sort of gentle act of advocacy I found very touching. Also the fact that the museum itself wasn't bombastic in the way in which they did it. They refused to have interviews about the installation. They had a quiet little note beside each of the works. This is here because of what is happening at the moment with the travel ban. And that got me thinking, about the way in which images can function, and how should a person like me, take on what is happening at the moment. It's true, in a way, I've worked on long-term projects that were about issues that one might deem activist, but I was completely unsettled by the notion of speaking to activism here, speaking as though I were some sort of authority, because I feel much more as though the true activists within my work are the people in the images, that if anything, I have been a kind of conduit to voices and presentations to the camera and to the viewer that were inspiring for me, and in a way touched my soul, but also were offered to me in moments when I had no real sense of what would be a strong encounter, what would I do to render a place. It's a very common photojournalistic notion that one goes to a site with a preconceived notion of what it is you want to say. Perhaps it's a very specific political message. And I was always very unsettled by that notion. If you wouldn't mind, put on the first image, please. Excuse me.
Can we drop the lights also?
Yeah, you can turn the lights down and maybe put it full screen. Maybe I can do that. As a child who grew up in America and with dual parentage, American and Kenyan, within me is this sort of mixed DNA. And so I've always felt the need to try and understand and reach across boundaries of religion, race, and nation. My first body of work, I think in a way what I can do for you most effectively now is just to show you 10 little anecdotes, describe the nature of the image, and in a way not only what it taught me, but how, in a sense, their activism is the strong thing that I recognize. I went back to Kenya soon after graduating from college here at a time when refugees were flooding across its northern borders. And this first body of work, most people won't remember the early 90s, the way in which these communities were rendered to us in the press, was always with this notion of these sort of victims of a cruel and malevolent world. And I was somehow more interested in the idea of community that goes through great hardship, but yet is there to somehow bolster one another in the aftermath of this time. The image on the right is from the Sudanese refugee camps. It's an image of Akwat Nyebol, her daughter Athok Doom, recovering from malaria, and Riak Warabek on the right. The image on the left is from the Rwandan refugee camps at a time when 250,000 people had traveled across the border of Rwanda into Tanzania. And here you have an image of the traditional birthing attendant, Nyirabahiri Esteri, holding the two children that she birthed just the night before. The children's names, Mukanzabonimpa and Nsabimana. They mean, God will grant me, but I do not know when, and I beg something from God. So in the midst of this kind of extraordinary turmoil, wherein people had said to me, why are you going to work in the camp of murderers, consigning 250,000 refugees to the role of murderer, it seemed to me of interest to try and complicate that equation, to try and broaden our vocabulary, our sense of what those communities mean. Something that was a follow-on measure of this, and which still troubles me greatly today with recent conversations about propriety of rendering other communities. My family was from Kenya, but by way of India and Pakistan. And much that was written about that material was that I was the son of a Kenyan father and an American mother. This was true, and I was proud of that fact. But then I sort of realized that it became a kind of a tagline. It was being used as a kind of validation of my images. But yet it failed to acknowledge that not only was I not of Kenyan birth, I was from India and Pakistan, but that the people that were rendered in these 5 different communities were of different religions, ethnic groups, linguistic orientations. And so in a way, what I've thought of in recent past is, mustn't we, now that things have turned so akimbo, mustn't we begin to think of a need to move beyond our confines, to reach beyond to others on a human level? Is there permission for that? Or are we relegated? Are we determined only to make work that comes directly from that which we have been born into? I, with DNA that is of mixed blood, of mixed parentage, I'm not sure quite how one reconciles that difference. On the Somali border, I mean, we will speak about photojournalism, and the gift of photojournalism is that we know that every 7 to 8 years in the Horn of Africa that there will be a famine. But in my lifetime of being there, never once have the countries begun to provide for what they know will be a coming famine. They need the images to spur the donor communities on. And so the feeding centers were the places that I was always shying away from, because I found that journalists and diplomats were coming to them, looking for the most malnourished child, making the photograph of this image of this soul lone character, and then using that in the newspapers. One night I had a conversation with a doctor in which he told me of the incidents of Somalis smothering their children in the border crossing from Somalia into Kenya, a very remote, arid desert region. And when asked why this incident, why this was happening, the doctor said to me, but it is a common knowledge that the Somalis are callous and aggressive by nature. So again, this idea, a proposal, Somalis are callous, they kill their children. What does the image do? What can the process of engagement with community of documentation do? In my estimation, that's a kind of question that then the process of photographing begins to try and unravel. I went to the same feeding center over the course of 3 weeks, the most malnourished children, and the images became a kind of refutation to the doctor's claims. Of course, one of the nurses latterly told me of a couple of children who had been with their mother in the desert crossing. The mother had arrived with only one child and had been brought directly to the feeding center. When she saw what they were capable of doing, of reviving these children, she broke down. When asked later why she had been so undone by the experience, she said that in fact, in the border crossing, she had smothered the other child, not realizing what the feeding center would be capable of, how they could restore the health of the child. And so for me, images have always been about that. They've always been about complicating or questioning our notions of otherness, particularly with Africa, questioning the way in which those communities are rendered to us in the West. 10 years later, I went back to the same Somali camps, which incidentally are still here today on the border between Somalia and Kenya. I found the same children who had been in the feeding center the years before and photographed them. And then at the end of my journey, a woman came to me, this Abshiro Aden Mohammed here pictured. And she came with her son, to whom she had dictated a letter, and he gave it to me. It was called A Camel for the Sun. It became the title of that book, and it enumerated the ways in which women and children suffer within the Somali society, but also more specifically within the camps of exile. Here today, we have 80% women and children in those camps, and the Kenyan government, because of the attacks from the group Al-Shabaab in the northern Horn area of the Kenya border, are wanting to close these camps, send 250,000 refugees back to an area that is in the midst of turmoil. At the same time that I was photographing in the camps in Kenya, a hero who had lived there for 10 years, I was asked to go to the Netherlands and to give a proposal what I might work on. And I said I was interested in religiosity and immigration. And at the time, it was Ramadan. And I was introduced to Zainab Azir Wadere. She, it turns out, had been living in Somalia during 10 years of the war. And only after the family had been murdered in front of her and she herself assaulted did they decide to leave the country, fleeing on a flight to the Netherlands. When they arrived, they were immediately put in an asylum seeker center. The infant child was as well treated, and then she was given psychological counseling. But during the month of Ramadan, the government had decided that she should leave the center. She had no passport, she had no money, it was winter, it was Ramadan. She had no means by which to get back to her country. And so the piece was made about not only her own belief system as a means by which to gain entry to her story, but about the trajectory of what had happened to her. And I mentioned this story sort of because it was a moment where I felt really part of something quite activist. We made a series of books. We distributed them to universities, judges, libraries, councilmen. We mounted a conference about the issue and the troubles of the Somali community in the Netherlands. In the wake of this proud moment came September 11th. 2 weeks later, Zainab and her son were put aboard a plane to Tanzania. The notion was to simply offload them in Tanzania and erase them from the equation. So here you have two possibilities. Why was this woman chosen? Why was she selected? Well, one could be because her story had been made so prominent in the press, in the media. So there is the person who has helped bring that forward. You feel devastated that in a moment you think that you're doing something effective and positive, that you might have cost this woman her freedom. During the course of the journey, the Somali lawyers petitioned the court, and the judge determined, in fact, that she had been taken unlawfully, counter to international human rights law. The plane landed in Tanzania. She and her son were kept on board, and 24 hours later, they were back in the Netherlands. So here you have this other option. Perhaps because her story was so well known, the government was then concerned about the negative publicity. She spent a further 7 years in limbo in the asylum seekers center without proper status. Only after repeated nervous breakdowns did they give her. She then won the right to bring her 2 daughters from the Ethiopian refugee camps to live with her. Today, they live all 3 in the northern part of the Netherlands. It's a means by which, in a sense, to illustrate what kinds of problems there can be when you engage in this kind of documentation, this kind of activism. In the latter 90s, I went to Afghanistan, in a way looking for the legacy left me by my grandfather. Sheikh Fazal, who died before I was born. These are two images of blind Kari brothers, and sisters Sima and Shahima, from the Nasserbach refugee camp. Both sets of images, the children were all born in exile. They've never known the homeland about which their parents tell them at night. And in the course of those journeys, each evening I would meet with the Shura, the Council of Elders. This was the late 90s. It was the advent of the Taliban. And I, as an American with a Muslim name, they welcomed me in one moment as a Muslim. But then they asked me what had happened with the Americans. They were our brothers when we were fighting the Soviets, and when they got what they wanted, they just discarded us. So for me, this was a very difficult thing to answer. I didn't want to be an apologist for my country. I understood their criticism. And 2 years later, when September 11th happened, and I myself had a difficult time getting back into my own country of birth, I felt very much for them in the notion that even if we were going to have to make aggressive retaliatory strikes in Afghanistan, perhaps we would take that as a moment's lesson for the way in which we engage with and insinuate ourselves into nations around the globe in the future. Of course, we know that we didn't use that as a moment of reflection. But for me, it was very devastating to know that the very people whom I had been offered this hospitality over the course of 3 or 4 years were now to suffer again at the hands of aggression. Several years ago, I was invited to work in Israel in the occupied territories. And at the moment that I was invited, I was worried about the notion of being, in a way, instrumentalized. I had great trepidation about that because I was not having any link to the region. I was fascinated by it, and I also realized that I wouldn't be accorded this privilege at another time. So I agreed to make a couple of initial forays. And I began, because of being an outsider, I was able to move fluidly across the borders between the occupied territories and within Israel, and given hospitality on both sides of the equation. It's a kind of a unique perspective. And so I started, obviously, by looking at 1948. I needed to understand the underpinnings of the conflict. I needed to be instructed. And I spoke to combatants on both sides of this divide. Men who would say that when they grew up on the streets of the town, they were speaking one another's language, and at how the events of 48 had driven between them this divide that had taken 65 years and still had not been healed. I then one day spoke to one of the combatants, and he told me about the site of the battle at Latrun. And then I thought I wanted to visit that space with him. And soon I realized the notion of 48, it's such, for us as Americans, it's such an obvious notion to interrogate. But within that country, within Israel, it's an extremely taboo-loaded subject. And I did the most obvious things. I wanted to go to the sites that had been the former villages, that had been erased, transformed, repurposed. Many of these sites had been overplanted by the Jewish National Fund, razed to the ground, the rocks taken away, and forests planted. This is the village of Al-Kabu, which today is nothing but a forest of conifers. Conifers planted simply as a means by which to have a forest grow quickly, the pine needles of which would then suffocate the undergrowth of the prior gardens of the Palestinians. So in doing this, it was a kind of a training manual for me. I was learning by going to these places. I was trying to get up to speed and be very open to what the place had to offer, what the people had to offer. And I began also to take the testimonies of people who they themselves had been evicted from these villages. One of the ones that troubles me the most to this day is an image of Munir Sabr. I spoke to him in the Shufat refugee camp. And it seemed that when he was a 6-year-old boy, he had been in Deir Yassin, and his brothers and his uncle had been massacred in front of him. Since he was young, he was not seen as being of an age that he might be a combatant, so he was let go. And in all of the 65 years since the time of his flight from Deir Yassin, no one had taken his story. Never had he been, or his family, been given any redress. And the notion, I mean, very simple and not overstated, the notion that someone comes and allows a kind of catharsis, the opportunity for you to claim your story and to realize that others find it to be of value, is for me essential. What troubles me most about this image is that when we, also with Eduardo and my friend from Slot, Aaron, mounted an exhibition in a series of conversations last year in Philadelphia, there was a panel discussion in which the New York Times correspondent, I was not there, raised the possibility that his testimony had been concocted. And so for me, this still is something that I find so I'm so incapable of accepting. That in order to move forward, you must accept the hurt that both sides have experienced. You must accept the damage that has been caused on another. What other community would accept the notion of the stories of their past being falsified? This notion of afforestation. I was invited to the south, to the Negev, to meet with the leader, Sayach al-Turi, of the Al-Arakib village. And we sat in the top, there's some small blue tents there. We sat within one of those. And he looked out across these troughs where the planting was to begin of the ambassador forest. Ambassadors from all over the world had come and planted in these troughs the beginning of what will in 20 years be a forest. And he spoke about how just months prior, the village that had been there had been razed to the ground. All of the homes destroyed and taken off the land. Here what we see in the rectangle there is the perimeter of the cemetery. That's all that was left. And I realized very quickly it was impossible to imagine what that space must have looked like only months prior. So for the first time in my life, I felt like it was essential to fly above the land, to look down, to imagine what these people were experiencing, to try and grasp a certain degree of a context of what was there. The time since, the village, every day they would build the protest tents, they would build shacks. Within 2 or 3 days, the IDF would come and raze them to the ground again. In the time since, it's been 100 times that it's been razed to the ground. The last piece is one that's called Independence Nakba. I thought, how do you measure the scar that lies within both of those communities? How do you measure the expanse of time, the 65 years since the start of the State of Israel? So there were diptychs, one Israeli, one Palestinian, that cover that expanse of time. The viewer then open to engage with both, open perhaps with a degree of empathy for both. Just want to close briefly because this is our friend Eduardo's last week in this series, and the last week as the head, no longer master, but the head of Wilson College. As it's a celebration of Eduardo's, Cadava's time as head of the college and as a brother and frequent collaborator, his impact on my work and life has been profound. I wish to take a moment to thank him for all that his friendship has made possible. In his commitment to nurturing the minds of his students and to engaging with the issues that he embraces in his work, he sets the highest standard of consistency between one's public and private roles as citizen. If one asks the question regarding how to sustain an activist life, the answer is to be found, in large part, in surrounding oneself with people just like Eduardo, who bolster our resolve and offer us comfort during troubled times. To honor Eduardo's years of commitment to the university, Liana and I are collaborating with the Princeton University Museum to define a group of images that will become part of the museum's collection in Eduardo's name. Given recent events and in the spirit of tonight's forum, we decided that the selection will be comprised of images that focus upon the people and nations that are increasingly marginalized and under attack, both within this country and beyond its borders. When the museum installs the work in the coming months, we hope that the images and voices of Abshiro Ad Muhammad, Ajo Achot, Achol Manyen, Zainab Azir Wadere will create a space for dialogue and help nurture the belief that the arts may also be a realm of solidarity, contemplation, and when necessary, open defiance. Thank you.
Now, let's see. It's picking me up, right? You can hear me. See, I feel a little absurd after coming after these two very heroic speeches, heroic in two different ways. Because, you know, I'm not heroic in any way, shape, or form. All I am really is a classroom teacher. One thing I will though say, Eduardo, you said that those schools in the villages are 2 decades. No, dear, more than 3 decades. They were founded.
More than 3 is still more than 2.
It's more than, you got it. You see, he's always right. So the thing is that, so I really took the, you know, I'm paid to teach is what I am. I'm a person who earns her living teaching. That's all I do. I can't think of that as activism. And the schools in the villages, you know, not Aboriginal, it's the landless illiterate, any caste, the word tribe is still used in Indian English, any caste, any tribe, it's the Indian poor. So we have, our standard is there must be less than 2 bighas of land, and I don't really know what bigha is, because I don't need to know. Because when I'm working there, I'm working there. I don't report anywhere. I don't have a web page, nothing. Less than 2 bighas of land and no cows. That's the standard. So it's got nothing to do with any kind of identity group, no. Also, what I would say is, of course, they don't pay me. This is quite true. But, and I said I was a paid teacher. Columbia pays me. They don't pay me, but on the other hand, it's our group. I'm born a caste Hindu, anti-casteist parents do not believe in the caste system, but that's easy when you're a metropolitan person. It still works down below, although it's illegal. And so our kind, caste Hindus, destroyed these people. So to an extent, what I do there is I repay ancestral debts. It's not a question of, and I say to them, I'm your enemy. I'm good, my parents were good. But 2 generations of good people do not undo 5,000 years of taking away the right to intellectual labor. You must do without me. So to an extent, therefore, on both sides, there is a certain way in which it's a very unheroic life, but and you know, listening to these fantastic speeches, I was very moved. I wanted to say to Chris that I was a member of Praxis International. You remember, Cornel, when I went to that Marxist picnic in 1983, my only guest was Gaio Petrovich, a hero, if ever there was one. And now Gaio's student is obliged to teach ethnic identity. I met up with him in Belgrade recently. I wanted to say that Václav Havel wrote for me how Spivak, that name which actually my first husband's grandfather bought to avoid pogroms, that's not their real name, but Havel wrote out for me how to write Spivak in Czech. It's not even a Czech name. And I wanted to tell these stories, saying, I too have touched these great guys. But that's all, really. I'm not I'm not a hero. I'm just a humanities teacher. Another thing that I would like to say before I begin is that, you know, I have been turned away from talking revolution. I think that no revolution can last, and this is a very gendered, persistent task, if the people who cannot be in this room are not somehow trained into the intuitions of democracy. So that the large, I mean, you just saw Erdogan winning, the Nazis won. Democracy is a very hospitable system. So, and in fact, the structure of democracy, arithmetical structure, 1 = 1, that does not, in fact, lead to a democratic society. The performative contradiction in a democracy is that you have to have something like a democratic society in order for the structure of democracy to work democratically. So to an extent, the work that you will see, which is really not activist work, both at the top, where the children of the superpower are very eager to help, and at the bottom, the landless illiterate of supposedly the largest democracy of the world, in the world. The work is this kind of sustaining of a normal world of social justice, rather than, you know, when I began the idea of working this way, I worked first with, and that's a very cloak and dagger story, which I can't tell you in 10, 15 minutes. I worked with a fantastic man called Zafrullah Chaudhry, a Bangladeshi guy who left his career in Britain as a doctor to do field hospitals in Bangladesh during the war. Zafrullah Chaudhry produced paramedics who were rural women. I'm talking about the 80s, before 86, before the schools opened. So he took these rural women, Muslim rural women in the 80s, and he brought them out and made them, trained them paramedics, and I used to travel with them. And I realized then that the two ways of looking at the future, one is to solve the problems, and that is very, very important, war, etc. But the other is to produce problem solvers so that in the very long run, the thing is not going to be constantly wars and solving problems. That's less glamorous. So that's what I learned from Zafar Bhai. Now, one day, I remember, 1991 cyclone, all of this is not written down. I have written stuff down, and I'll try to keep within my time. In 1991, enormous cyclone in the Bay of Bengal. Myself, another barefoot teacher, and 2 Bangladeshi guys in a trawler, we are taking European community rice and lentils to the place, right? And the Bay of Bengal is an unbelievable kind of thing. I mean, there's no electricity anywhere. And the guys say to us that the tide is so high that they're not going to be able to dock the trawlers, so therefore we're just going to have to hang out there until the morning. There's so much to tell here, but I'm not going to say anything. I really want to tell stories, talk for 2 hours. But at any rate, towards the morning we were docking, there were these women, and you know the thing there, the mud there. Is there anyone from Bangladesh here? There you are. And anyone else who understands Bengali? There you are. You see that mud is like ice here. You know, it's a different kind of mud. It's called, by my Bangladeshi friends, Prem Kada. That is a love mud, which is going to hold you. It won't let you go. Women running towards the trawler because they had slipping in that mud, and you know, you could smell the bodies and so on. Unbelievable destruction. Running, saying, we don't want to live. They're treating us like animals. And you know who? And they are a wonderful organization, fantastic, really heroic, Doctors Without Borders. Why? Because they were using interpreters And people don't think, this is not just Doctors Without Borders, but public health at Columbia. They don't realize that way at the bottom, especially in a gendered situation, those who can speak the imperial languages have nothing but contempt for those who can't. And so the guys who were translating for Doctors Without Borders for the women were translating wrong. And when the women heard, so that the women felt that they were being treated like animals. And so when the women heard there were two women who knew Bengali coming, they came slipping and sliding on that mud, saying, we don't want to be helped. And that's the first right, the right to refuse. And so one compares this with the paramedical work of sustaining a kind of normality generation after generation. It's a sort of gendered view of the absolutely necessary heroism, but supplemented by producing problem solvers so that perhaps in the very long run, it can change from this sort of view. And that is where I think I want to understand revolution. You know, people complain, in fact, that Perry Anderson, Etienne Balibar, and so on, that Marx did not write about the revolutionary subject. For us, that's an opening. I quote Marx's wonderful sentence, the revolution of the 19th century, you know this, some of you know this, will find its content in the poetry of the future. That's Marx. Poetry of the future. That's what we are talking about here. Balibar complains that Marx rectified himself too much, and therefore he can't be followed as a doctrine. But that's where the opening lies. Okay, so now I believe I have used 10 minutes already.
You have 5 more.
5 more, okay. So let me read fast, okay? Let me read fast, because I
15,
actually...
which is more than 10.
I actually took, 20 is even more. I actually took Eduardo because I'm nothing but, just a paid teacher. So I took Eduardo very, very much to, please don't mind, I'm speaking really to the student friends in the audience. How to sustain an activist life. I took it at your word. First, you ask, what am I sustaining? In the sustainable development model, you work at how much development you can sustain for optimal profit maximization and or cost efficiency. In fact, it becomes, don't forget, Earth Institute, my school, in fact, it becomes a minimalization of development and an optimalization of cost efficiency and profit maximization. So therefore, you have to ask, the first sustainability as a model is the first thing. I'm speaking to my student friends. Please don't mind those who know about this much more than I, the grown-ups. The first time I spoke, there were more students in the audience. So you then have to see what the development is. Quite often, it is to take poor folks of color and gender and give them enough credit to put them in the circuit of capital, but not to train them as subject so that they know how capital can be used for social justice. I'm just putting one sentence here. Believe me, there's a great deal of work I could talk about, this follow-up work, to see how there is a certain kind of low-grade racism that makes the world go round in this work. Indeed, as I have explained in an essay I wrote on development, most courses on sustainable development have a module on how to invest. Thus, the subject remains the Princeton undergraduate, and the top-down recipient is capitalized. So that's my first point. What is it that I'm sustaining? Second, fundraising is not activism. I'm not saying that it is bad. I'm just saying that it is not activism. This point is related to the first. For what or whom are the funds being raised? To make the recipient or recipients become the gendered subject of capital is not something that can be done by remote fundraising and then donating the funds. My feeling is not to make a distinction between career and family on one side and activism on the other. And in spite of all the New Age fathers, this is still a very gendered contrast, I'm saying. My feeling is not to make a distinction. I'm trying to answer Eduardo's question, how to sustain. Not to make a distinction between career and family on the one side and activism on the other, on the sustainability model. My feeling is to ask yourself how you can be useful for the largest group of people. It's not about heroism. My third point is about joining demonstrations and protests and so on. All of this are excellent things. But they can become, especially with the internet and blogging and so on, they can become just preaching to the choir, speaking to live or digital groups of people who resemble you. But democracy is also about equality with people who do not resemble you at all and may not even be such good people. So here I would say, ask yourself if in what you choose, you're really being effective in making a change. For this, you need to change yourself in terms of the person or group you're trying to help, and think of real help as making a change in the policymakers. Just talking and becoming celebrated among your own group, it's very nice, it's a good feeling, and it's better than shopping till you drop. But on the other hand, on the other hand, making a change in policymakers, believe me, that is so unbelievably difficult. It's just, I mean, I'm just telling the young people, keep that in your head. In closing, let me tell you how I fell into what I do, which other people sometimes, like my friend Eduardo, call activism, but I really think of as an obsession. I found that in terms of Africa and Asia, but also in Latin America, and today also in the United States, the world is established by the largest sector of the electorate that is either very poorly educated by class apartheid or not educated at all. Democracy has body count. These people are kept mindless so that they can be pulled forward and vote and elect these terrifying leaders. Democratic process. The new party, Fanon's third chapter, not the first chapter that Jean-Paul Sartre misunderstood, and therefore everybody says Fanon is saying decolonization is violence. No, Fanon's third chapter is an unbelievably smart chapter, which talks about what post-colonial nations will become. So I thought, and you know, these people, and men forget too much gendering, because unfortunately, they're talking about human trafficking. I've been on these huge domestic violence trials. You know, on one, another member of the jury was Winnie Mandela, so I got to know her. These fantastic big things. And you see that the first cog in human trafficking is often a woman. So patriarchally constructed women, you have to realize that thinking rape culture and bribe culture is normal. That is the normalcy that this kind of effort confronts. It's not glamorous, and it's good not to have a great deal of celebrity seeking in this kind of effort, because you are bound to fail. You must learn from your mistakes. The people who come forward and say, I've done 26 million people, etc., and I'm really succeeding, take a deep breath and don't take them seriously. So I thought I would be most useful if I worked on that level as a trained humanities teacher. Because as a Rosa Luxemburg-style social democrat, I believe in the state, but also know that just a change in state formation or changing laws does not work if the laws have to be enforced. So my experience is that the model of the state changes at the top, but nothing changes down below. Therefore, I have had to focus, because I cannot teach below the NGO radar, a part of the largest sector of the electorate, in anything but my native language, which I know well. Therefore, I'm obliged to teach in West Bengal. This has got nothing to do with identity politics at all. I really don't like identity politics. In Africa, since I believe one should not be useful only to one's own group, I work at the level of research and development, otherwise known as R&D. I encounter class resistance. Quote, Africa is not a monolith, so that there is the R part and the D part. And there's no time to talk about it, but that's about as far as I can go. Finally, the question, whose activism? I'm imagining that I'm talking to a typical Princeton undergraduate. If you think there is no such thing, then imagine how much truer it is about a monolithic Africa or Asia. In fact, I encountered a Princeton English undergraduate who had voted for Trump on a PBS TV program. How would I tell her to sustain activism? We have to cover the realization that the Princeton undergraduate, much as I love him or her, is not necessarily the subject of activism in the world's wealth of languages, social formations, and subject positions. Notice I don't use the very bad word culture. So I'm saying wealth of languages, social formations, and subject positions. So one has to realize that one must not reverse legitimize the global south, and one must not reverse legitimize any group, including Princeton undergraduates, if one wants finally to be collectively useful. I was going to ad-lib here about Ujjwal cutting trees, but I can't. I have pictures I could show you that might be interesting, but I wrote here, I think I have used up my 15 minutes. In conclusion, I will say then, in the best case scenario, rather than make a polarization between career, family, and activism, if you can transform it into just being useful for others and then focus. Know that the work is collective all over the world. You're not going to save the whole world with an interpreter in tow, the flavor of the week going from place to place. If you can transform it into focus, and rather than merely focusing, change yourself rather than only participate in activities that cannot bring change, and don't think of yourself as the globally representative subject of struggle. Let's talk more when we discuss. I just want to finish by saying, just expressing my joy in encountering Olivia Rutasibwa, Belgian Rwandan, night before last in Utrecht, as a young woman who thinks more or less the same way and better. So I just want to take her name as I stop. I hope that she will be a person who will give this talk much better in maybe 5 years. Thank you.
What can I say now? If Gayartri complained after the two, imagine what I can say after her and before Cornel. So I will be quick before Cornel descends upon us. I do think that one way to sustain an activist life is what Eduardo has done these past 8 years by organizing this lecture series devoted to social justice. And I am grateful to him for that. I am also grateful to all of you. It's an honor to be with you tonight. I was born in Greece, and even though I spent most of my time during the year in the States, I spent a big part in Greece too. I'm still very much involved in Greece. I do not know any other way of life except the activist life. My father was a communist leader when it was absolutely prohibited to be a communist in Greece. He took part in the resistance against the Germans and the ensuing civil war in Greece, both in Athens and in the mountains. He spent 25 years of his life in prison and in exile in concentration camps on island in Greece. And he lived a big part of his life being clandestine. When I was born, he was on exile. He was condemned to death 3 times, and he escaped. I grew up never knowing whether he would show up at night, with a constant fear that he would be taken, imprisoned, executed. My mother was also an activist, whatever that means exactly, but very young during the war. While she was studying medicine, she was on a horse administering both physical and emotional help to people all over the mountains in Greece. I have pictures of her like that. She would always help, and even when she dismounted the horse and I was born, she was still running around helping friends, relatives, guests, strangers, the world. My mother died last month at the age of 98, having experienced a whole century and the biggest part of 20th century, which was so detrimental for Europe, on her own body. Wars, civil wars, upheavals, dictatorships, censorships, torture, prison, everything. But it did not even occur to her to have another life, but an activist life. And it did not even occur to me that I would have any other life, to be honest, except the life of activism. That is, according to our amazing Nobel laureate poet Odysseus Elitis, that I always thought that my fate was the fate of the innocent, as he puts it. There were 2 events in my life that made me understand, of course, that activism is a very complicated thing. In 1973, November 1973, when there was a dictatorship in Greece and the students at the National Technical University were closed in the university and revolted against the dictatorship, I was going to school. I was in my first year of high school. I was in the bus going to school. I stopped because I saw people gathered. I got in. I stayed there 3 days and 3 nights. But I had a small break because my parents were looking for me. I was extremely young. They came down, they found me, and my father had a long talk with me. He said, "Do you really want to be in here? Do you really believe that you can do something by being at the Polytechnic?" I said, "Yeah, absolutely." What did I know? He said, "You know, you might be taken, you might be imprisoned, and they will ask you to say that you did not mean to be here. They will ask you to say that this was not what you wanted to do. Are you willing to say that? Because if you are not willing to say that, then you can stay. But if you cannot resist, if you cannot really keep that, then you should come home." Of course, I answered, yes, I can. I did not know much, but it stayed with me, that it is a very serious thing. Yes, I don't believe that there is any more revolution, as Gayartri said, but to resist, it's quite important. And then a little later, when I was taking the exams for the university, one of my teachers said, everybody continuously says, "Oh, I did not mean that, I did not know anything about that." Exactly because you did not do anything that you are not innocent. You have to always be doing something. So I grew up with this. I grew up thinking that I have to take part in all kinds of movements. So I organized student movements, I organized workers, I went all over the world doing that. I wrote literature for movements, I wrote flyers, I delivered flyers, I talked to people. I've been doing all this, and now this last year, since 2010, with the crisis, when Greece fell into this deep crisis, economic crisis, I still do it with its pain, with its problems. It's never easy to do things like that. It's always extremely complicated. You never know what side you are in. Desires get very conflicted so often, and even ideologies. But I've always thought that it's important to be able to resist. Now, what I would say, that because there are very many ways of resisting and very many ways of activism, as Elitis, again, the Nobel laureate poet says, to each his own weapons. I think that one way for me to resist, to lead an activist life, is actually to do poetry. To, if I can, read poetry with my students, if I can read poetry with anyone, if I can really help people understand poetry, then I will have achieved a lot. That's quite an activism. And I do that with the classroom a lot, and this is one of the things that people always tell me, but poetry is so difficult, and then they realize that if they can actually read poetry and understand it, they have done a lot. So, I would like to read some poetry with you, just to change a little bit. The poetry of the future, as Gayartri says. The first one is from Klitos Kyrou, all Greek poets. The voice and the poet. A voice fades away on the street, a voice lights up in the upper floors, will descend the stairs, slowly, slowly will touch the ground, will pierce into the ground, will sink deeper and deeper, will be trampled down by wild beasts, crowbars, automobile wheels, iron and cement. Sound will contain vibrations of fire, will resemble a lover's complaint, will wrinkle the spreading oil of silence. The poet will kneel tenderly, dig up some earth, cut it up in his palms, and plant it in a flower pot. In spring, many small voices shall bloom. A second one. From Aris Alexandrou. And yet, I did not take my life. Have you ever seen a proud cedar rolling on its own toward the saws blade? Our place is right here in the forest, with our branches cut off, our barks half burned, our roots wedged into the rocks. And the same motif of poetry being maybe not the most violent or the most sure way of activism, but still a very important way of activism, is by Manolis Anagnostakis, another poet, who says, and above all, no self-deceptions. At the very most, construe them as two dim searchlights in the fog, as a postcard to absent friends with two words only, I live. Because, as my friend Titus too once rightly said, no verse today can mobilize the masses, no verse today can overthrow the established order. So be it. Disabled, show your hands. Judge that you may be judged. These two hands, one hand or two hands of the poets, are hands that built. They write poetry. And this is what they're saying. They might be disabled, they might be crippled, they might not be the hands that built, but they are still there, they judge, they speak. And he reverses, of course, the New Testament verse, you may not judge. It's actually you may judge, you should judge in order that you should be judged. And I will read one more poem from Michalis Katsaros to end with it, which is called My Testament. It's all about resistance. Resist him who builds a little home and says, how nice to be here. Resist him who returns once more to his home and says, "Thank God." Resist the Persian carpets of apartment buildings, the little fellow in the office, the export-import company, all private education, the tax collector, and me even, who tells you about all this. Resist him who endlessly waves from a platform to the parade that goes by. Resist the president of the Court of Appeals, the bands, the drums, the triumphant marches, the higher conclaves wherein a lot of talking is done, and where the advisors and the congressmen drink coffee, the dried-up ladies who hand out leaflets of saints' lives, incense and myrrh, and me too, who tells you about all this. Resist all those who call themselves great, who compose speeches by the season, by the winter stove, the flatteries, the good wishes, and the bows of secretaries and of cowards to the all-knowing leader. Resist the immigration services and the passport offices, the terrible flags of nations and their diplomacy, the factories of war material, those who call lyrical the beautiful words in anthems, the sickly songs with lamentations, the audiences, the wind, all the indifferent and the wise, those who pretend that are your friends, and even against me, who tells you this, resist. Then, and only then, can we cross over to freedom. I think I will stop here for Cornel to come and continue.
We do want to save time to hear your voices. I am here to salute my dear brother Eduardo Cadava. I have known him for over 25 years. He and I taught a course, The Age of Emerson, reading that towering man of letters in the 19th century, along with Frederick Douglass and a host of others. Brother Eduardo is an intellectual powerhouse. He's a moral and spiritual force for good, in the language of John Coltrane. And he is a brother with a golden heart. And that's rare to find in the academy. Outside of the academy, it's hard to find in the suite or in the street. So after 8 years, and that's 8 years with no sabbatical, that's serious sacrifice. 8 years he's been leader. 10
years.
It's been 10 years now?
10 years.
For sabbatical. 10 years since sabbatical and 8 years leading. Boy, that's even more sacrifice. So we're talking about, you see why the sister Liana, his beloved wife, was talking about his sacrifice. It's very real indeed. But he's part of a rich legacy of Princetonians who exemplify levels of intellectual engagement and activism, of visionary thinking and exemplary action. Of Norman Thomas, probably one of the greatest activists of the 20th century, class of 1905 here at Princeton. Of Edward Said, my very, very dear brother, graduating in the 1950s, along with Ralph Nader in the 1950s. Of Wendy Brown, one of the leading political theorists, teaching at Berkeley for 30 years. So when we think about what an activist, how you sustain yourself, first thing you go to are the examples. Immanuel Kant says examples are the go-kart of judgment. Exemplary individuals, exemplary movements, exemplary institutions, exemplary forms of organizing and mobilizing, and it's fundamentally rooted on the question, how do you preserve integrity in an age of cupidity and venality? An age of love of money, an age in which everybody's for sale and everything is for sale. That's the crucial question for everybody, young people. Gayartri and I were coming along as intellectuals and activists in the 80s. the country was not as commodified. It was commodified, but not as hyper-commodified as today. The university wasn't as corporate. The undergraduates weren't as pre-professional. But that's serious business. It's hard to be an activist in a sense of calling if all you're thinking about is your career. It's hard to be true to your vocation if all you're thinking about is your profession. And keep in mind, your calling is connected to recalling those in the past who constitute win at your back as thinking, acting, loving, laughing. And vocation is tied to invocation. And there's no accident that without a sense of history, without a Sankofa sensibility in which you refuse to move forward until you're connected with the best of those who raised their voices in the past, there's no way that you can conceive of being an activist. And poetry, for me, is at the center of it. I believe that poets are the vanguard of the species. And by poets, I'm not talking about versifiers. I'm talking about those poets in that last line of the revolutionary artist Percy Shelley, and published after his death, when he said, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. They were poets of life, and they used imagination to conceive of alternative realities given the nightmarish one. The neo-fascisms in Turkey and USA and Hungary and France and Netherlands, all of these neo-fascist movements escalating every day, predicated in part on trying to convince people we know you're suffering and there's no alternative but the right-wing populism, the authoritarianism. Poets say, no, there are alternatives. It's about absence, as Brother Jeff Stout was saying in the seminar today in regard to Jane Addams and John Dewey. It's about absence, the not yet rooted in the present. And integrity, honesty, decency, courage in the face of whatever confronts one. Brute force, lies, mendacity, character assassination, literal assassination. There is a choice that you can make, and it has to do with finding joy in emptying yourself and trying to have impact on others before the worms get your body.
I really want to thank all of you for being here. I mean, I cannot tell you how meaningful it is for you to help send me off. There are a lot of years, as Cornel said here, a lot of, I've known, with the exception of Chris, I've known everyone for decades. And Chris, I actually met after he had already been in my house, which not knowing him, he was in my house being interviewed at one point. Through a mutual friend of mine who I've known also a very long time. So there are many years of friendship that are represented here. We did run a bit late, later than I thought, but I would like to give you an opportunity to ask a few questions. We do have also a reception in the Julian Street Library. I think I'll just welcome all of you there too. I don't think everyone will come, but if you did come, I think it would be okay. So that's in the Julian Street Library at Wilson College, but why don't I say we'll take 3 questions. Yes.
Two alternative realities. And 60 million people believe in one alternative reality that denies science, denies global warming, denies evolution, denies the fact that Trump lied about President Obama wiretapping his phone, because they're brainwashed willfully by Fox News, Breitbart News, right-wing hate radio. And so in this reality, how can wonderful progressives like all of these people on the stage, how can we get them to be recognized by the corporate media that censors them? I never see Cornel and
Yes, Cornel.
Cornel and Chris, as you were mentioned.
I'm actually blessed to be on corporate media every once in a while.
Yes.
And I try to tell the truth. I try to tell the truth about the suffering going on in the chocolate slices of the city, and indigenous peoples and working peoples and women dealing with domestic violence and so forth and so on. Dalit people in India and poor Jews in Soviet Union and Palestinians under Israeli occupation. So I do have access to it. And then, then the threats come.
Yes, right here.
So it's a very interesting time we're in right now, especially with the man who's sitting in the office. This is an amazing series that you put together, and all of you just did a phenomenal job. Sitting in between Cornel West and Chris Hedges is not an easy thing to do. But all of you did a wonderful job, and you shared passions with us. And I wanted to share a couple of things, and it's interesting because poetry is something I was thinking about when I was walking in here, and it's a kind of an emotional time, and especially after the election. So a couple of things that I'll share if you don't mind, and then I have a question at the end. I'm Persian. I was born and raised here. Both my parents born in Iran. I'm 32 and 35 to give you a time frame. And my father, when he was 8, 9 years old, they would memorize the Persian poets. So Sadi has a poem where there are 3 parts. And the first part, he says that we're all a part of one body, one world, one fabric. And the second thing that he says is that when the smallest part of the body suffers pain, the whole body feels it. So you could imagine a splinter in your finger and you don't have a tweezer to take it out. For hours you're suffering. And then the third thing that Sadi says is that when he or she watches the suffering of others and does nothing, they cannot call themselves human. So I think of that, and that's part of me, part of kind of who I feel I am. I'm sorry I'm a little bit emotional, but it is a crazy time that we live in. And then I think of this series that you put together, which thank you so much. This is a beautiful thing, especially in light of where we are today with what this gentleman shared with us. A lot of people have feelings like that. But, the next thing I think of is one of my favorite King quotes, which is, it's always the right time to do the right thing. Absolutely. And then I think about probably one of my other favorite poems, and one of the other most courageous people we can think of, Muhammad Ali, the shortest poem in the English language. So 1975 Harvard commencement speech, she's finished to a raving response, and someone asks for a poem. And he says, me, we. And there's 2 ways to take that, but I like to take it in the humanist fashion and to say that we're all one. And now, what I wanted to say was, I remember, I love the radio. TV I don't like. It's a waste of time to me, and you get sucked into it. So I listen to NPR, and I remember after the election in November, I was just tears started coming down my eyes to think of a 19-year-old woman on a subway train in Manhattan wearing a hijab, and all of a sudden 3 white 20-year-olds saying Heil Trump and terrorizing this young woman to rip her hijab off. And this is what we're living in right now. This is a surreal situation. And so I try to avoid that. I feel sad in a way, because to me, you're sitting here and what's the topic of this lecture? How it is to be an activist. And that comes to my question. But the last thing that I wanted to put on top of this is yesterday, I'm hungry, I go to get a bite to eat, the TV's on, and all of a sudden I see a clip of the protest, the pro-Trump rally. I don't know how many of you saw it, but at Berkeley. And there's a pro-Trump rally in all places, the Martin Luther King Park. And all of a sudden, you see a pro-Trump supporter just absolutely devastatingly clock this woman. Part of my vernacular, but the montage was I just turned my head and walked out of there. And so these kind of things shake me in a way that I'm just like, I can't handle this. I'm too sensitive. This is too much for me. And now I'm sitting in front of 5 giants that shared a piece of their soul. And thank you so much. Thank you all so much. You know, thank you. And because, well, so I'm getting to it. Sorry, but so in the spring.
No, brother, we're running out of time, man. You got to ask questions of whether people have questions.
Is this,
yeah.
And then thank you for saying, in the spring, small voices will come. I'll never forget that. But my question is, what is it, if you don't mind, to share that sustains you, and some of you mentioned, but sustains that activist nature? Because I find myself in this atmosphere just crushed and kind of overwhelmed, and these things are very difficult. So thank you. Sorry for the time.
You want to say something?
Another question.
I'll answer it quickly, and that is that what sustains it is anger. As Augustine says, hope has 2 beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are and the courage to see that they don't remain the way they are. And the way that anger is maintained is that you don't sever yourself from a real relationship with the oppressed, which is why I teach in a prison. I can't walk out of those prison doors and be passive, because I have an agency that my students don't have. And I can't forget their faces, and I can't forget their stories, and I can't forget the tragedy that has enveloped their lives and the lives of their family and the lives of their community, and really all of our own lives. And so I would say, for those who care to fight on behalf of justice, you can never allow the oppressed to become an abstraction, which is why I spent 20 years in places like El Salvador and Gaza and Sarajevo, and spent 2 years writing a book with Joe Sacco on the poorest parts of the United States, so that these people are real. These people are, you know, that you build relationships with them. And, you know, I would just close by saying that and Cornel not only came in and spoke to our students, but then came back and taught a course on the intro to philosophy, and I'm sure he'll second what I say, that when you are confronted with that kind of integrity, brilliance, dignity, you know, there's that old story, it's not what you do with life, it's what you do with what life gives you, and life has given these people almost nothing, and that they can rise up with such majesty. It doesn't change your kind of dark, my very dark view of where we are and where we're going, but it empowers you. It is a transcendent force. And I think that, you know, hardest thing that we face now is to honestly grasp where we are, not only as a nation, but as a species, and yet rise up and do the right thing anyway. But we're never going to do that if we're alone. We must have community, and we must step outside of our privileged enclaves in order to make sure that we have bonded with the wretched of the earth.
But Brother Crystal, wouldn't you agree, though, that your anger is a fruit of your caring, the fact that you refuse to be indifferent and callous? And love really is at the center of it. You see, because this Trump business, you said, I don't believe in fetishizing Trump. Black people have been dealing with Trumps for 400 years. It's true. It's not a new thing in that sense, you see what I mean? So when you come out of 400 years of being hated, and yet we still trying to teach the world how to love. You see, from Coltrane to Kendrick Lamar last night. Damn. He's wrestling, you see. So Nina Simone, Aretha. So that don't get overheated when you see evil. You got to get empowered when you see it and connect with others who are fighting it. Because it's not new. Trump is as American as cherry pie. He didn't fall from the sky.
No, he didn't. Okay, I will give a short answer, which is, well, as I said, you know, what sustains me is I'm a bit obsessed. I can't not do it. And I get very depressed. But on the other hand, I get up in the morning and somehow I find that I'm still moving at it. You know what I mean? So I don't know where it comes from. I sometimes say that it comes from the immense moral luck I had in having the parents I had. So I've supported myself since I was 17 years old. They certainly didn't give me money. But what they did give me was spirit. And to an extent, I think this is something that I can't deny. I'm completely obsessed with, and I haven't really described anything in terms of what it is that I do, because I thought I was supposed to talk about how to sustain an activist life responsible toward the people to whom I was speaking. You know, so therefore, that's what I talked about. But it's this obsession doesn't also fall from the sky. And I agree with Cornel absolutely. Trump is a symptom. You know, you've suddenly found in him a person to point your finger at. No, in fact, the complicity, we are folded together with that jerk. And if we recognize that, then we can do something about it. Otherwise, you see all this decolonize, colonizer was bad. Hey, what's coming back in globality is our old structures of corruption. So that therefore, those are the kinds of things, just an obsession with carrying on with that. I think that's what it is.
This last question right here. This question's for Chris, but I'd be interested in what any of you had to say. I've closely followed your books for the last 10 years. So a lot of the prescriptions in your books have guided my life decisions. And particularly in 2014, the entirety of 2014, I was a humanitarian aid worker in Afghanistan. And for many reasons, one of them being I was the only young female in a compound of men. I'm sure you've seen that environment. I felt responsibility to commit acts of resistance, mostly because I wanted a project that really helped Afghan people. And that wasn't always at the heart of everything that we were doing. So I experienced many themes from your books. I lost power, I lost status, I felt like a pariah, and eventually I lost the protection of the institution or my company, and I lost the allegiance, and I came home feeling very unanchored, and I knew that Princeton probably had a scholarship waiting for me, so I quickly rushed back on board to an institution that was mainstream. I again feel protected, I again feel cared for, I again feel powerful, and like I have a window open to status. I've never been at, Malcolm Gladwell called this the Versailles of New Jersey. I've never been at a place like this before. But I pass by your books, and every time I see your name, I wonder, have I copped out? And so my question for any of you is, can I live a life of resistance as a Princeton student? Can I do it from this place of power, or am I copping out?
Well, there's no place, including Princeton, where there are not egregious acts of injustice around you. And suffering. The temp maintenance workers here who are denied benefits and a living wage. The protests over the naming of a school and a college over a racist who destroyed the lives of tens of thousands of African American families. There's always a battle to fight. And I, like you, spent 8 years at Colgate and then at Harvard, institutions of privilege. And those were combative years for me, in some ways uncomfortable years. But that education, that ability to remove myself from the cant of the wider society and sit down and learn to think independently. Some people are autodidacts, I had to be taught, was extremely important. And I had many great mentors, some of whom Cornel knows, James Luther Adams and Christopher Stendhal at Harvard and others. And so I wouldn't beat up on yourself. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, somebody who covered war for 20 years, I don't write about this very much, but I broke down completely after the war in the Balkans, the war in Kosovo. I was a wreck. I had started in El Salvador in '83, and 2 decades later, you know, huge numbers of people that I had been close to and worked with were dead. I had just, you know, I carry hundreds of traumatic images within me, and it took me 3 years to recover. And during those 3 years, I wasn't particularly effective as an activist. We all have limits. Courage, I know from war, is never a constant. And one has to find, and you know, Cornel can probably speak to this perhaps better than I can, but one has to find that balance between how to sustain yourself and yet resist, and not let those acts of resistance destroy you. And it destroyed many of my colleagues and friends who never adjusted. And I think that we talk about love. You know, when I came back, what PTSD does, and you may have suffered from it as I did, is it makes you numb. You can't feel, and you can't sleep. So I think we probably went through a very similar experience where, you know, 3 hours into the night, you're jolted awake, your heart is racing, you're sweating, you don't sometimes remember what you dreamt, you don't. But that comes in waves, night after night after night, until you're so incapacitated through exhaustion and through that numbing that you can't even get up and shave, or you can't take a shower. And for me, coming back, that 3-year process was really about learning how to reconnect in many ways with my kids. I remember my daughter came home from school one day. I was writing books, but I'd lost my job at the New York Times. I was never going to get another journalism job in America after denouncing the war in Iraq, which I did on Charlie Rose, by the way. And that's why I've been on since. But I remember my daughter came home, and I was making her a peanut butter and jelly sandwich after school, and she said, I don't know how, with everything you've lived and done, I don't know how you can be happy making, and I said, no, it's because of everything that I've lived, I know how sacred it is to make you a sandwich. So, yeah, evil's real, but so is love. And I think there's no accident that in all of the conflicts I covered, those people who were able to resist most effectively were couples, often of mixed, you know, Serb and Croat or Serb and Muslim, who would shelter others. And I think that power of love is what sustains you, that you need it, that you have to find it, that there's nothing wrong with reaching the point that you reached. I reached it. We're fragile, vulnerable people who can be hurt and crushed. And we must at once find the capacity to resist, but also that kind of shelter that love provides. And I think it's those two combinations that go to making a complete life.
I would also say, use your privilege. It's much more scary than what you have described. Because as you are speaking now, what was most impressive for me was that you were acknowledging privilege. And, that's very important, but use it. And then you will see how big the challenge is. And I just want to say a small thing about my mother, since I spoke about my parents. My mother was, had to become an American citizen because my brother was a doctor in Virginia, and he wanted her as a dependent, right? And so she came. She worked all her life for people. And I'm nothing compared to her. But she decided, and this is very much my Du Bois thing, that, I've become a citizen of another country. I have to do something for it. And so she gave, in her late 70s and 80s, this little Bengali woman, spoke with an accent, cancer of the jaw, so she couldn't wear teeth. She gave more than 10,000 hours of volunteer work taking care of post-traumatic stress syndrome victims. I just wanted to say it. Think of what a mother that is. So I would say those two things. Because she'd become a citizen. She felt I had to do something for the country of my citizenship. I can't just cook Indian food for everyone. So to that extent, I would say, number one, use your privilege. Then you, now that you said it, you haven't opted out. And that's much harder. And number two, the big challenge. And number two, I just wanted to speak for my mother as I hear the two of you speak.
And I want to say something, too. We're all complicitous. Nobody's outside. You cannot really work from the outside. We are inside always. So whether it's Princeton or not, it doesn't matter. It's being aware of what it means to be inside and fighting against things.
Yeah, no, that's true. I know we got the end.
You called something up in us.
But the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel used to say, some are guilty, everyone is responsible.
Yes, there we go. Indeed.
You see, it's the responsibility that Dostoevsky and others talk about to each other, that Levinas talks about in regard to the face. But some are more guilty.
Yes.
The folks who dropped those 26,172 bombs last year are more guilty than you and I are. But we're still responsible. It was dropped in our name. Killing those innocent folk and also maybe hitting some gangsters and terrorists, but no acknowledgement of the precious innocent folk. You see what I mean? So in that sense, never view oneself as always already co-opted. You're always already responsible, and the question becomes, what form of weaponry, what gifts do you have that you can use to try to serve others, equip others, enable others, and so forth. My beloved daughter's here. She's on the way to college. She's not going to get co-opted unless she chooses. I know she's not going to do that, huh? Say to her, you ain't going to do that, girl. But I want her to go to college. How come? Because she chooses to. And I'm going to support her in doing that. But integrity, honesty, decency can be enacted in whatever context. Whatever context. It's just, we had to be prepared to be countercultural and counter-hegemonic and countervailing in whatever context. But I know it's getting real late. You all been very patient. We appreciate it.
Please help me thank them, everybody here. Thank you very much.